About the tale Father Against Mother. The short story Pai Contra Mãe by Machado de Assis is part of the Machado's so-called realistic phase, being published in 1906 in the book Relíquias da Casa Velha. The tale, narrated in third person, takes place in Rio de Janeiro, in the times of the Empire. It has as a backdrop the Brazilian 19th century slave scenario, although it was written by the author in the post-abolition historical context. The tale describes the story of Cândido Neves, who, because he does not fit into any occupation, becomes a hunter of escaped slaves. The occupation doesn't earn her much money and the situation worsens when her first child is born. Monica, Cândido's wife's aunt, suggests putting the child in the Roda dos Ejeitados. About to abandon his son, Cândido pursues a slave who already knows she is worth good money for the ransom. To save his son, Cândido has to arrest the pregnant mulatto woman and she fears losing her son with the punishment that will be imposed on her for having run away. Therein lies the struggle of the father against the mother. Here we have the dilemma in which Cândido is involved, whether to save his son or to save the slave's son. What did Cândido choose? Was it easy for him to make the decision? And after the decision is made, how does he deal with it? Pardo, of poor origin, in a country devastated by the effects of slavery, Machado de Assis wants to expose the slave regime and raise awareness of the issue of black people who, even after the signing of the Lei, is still seen as a commodity. In addition, his genius is in narrating everyday stories of his time and through events to make us reflect and also analyze human behavior, with issues relevant to today. Main characters. Cândido Neves, the protagonist of Father Against Mother, is in love with Clara and has a child with her, but he can't find the money to support them. He works as a hunter of runaway slaves, but ends up having difficulties in getting money from the job, having to give his son up for adoption due to lack of money. Along the way, he captures the slave Armanda and aborts her, but is happy to earn the money for the capture and be able to keep her child. Clara, Cândido's wife, gets pregnant and works hard to try to earn some money, but she can't handle the financial situation of the house. Monica, Clara's aunt, warns the couple about the difficulties of supporting a child and advises them to donate their child to charity. Armanda, a pregnant slave who runs away from her owner because of the mistreatment she has received. She is captured by Cândido, who, despite her pleas, ends up fighting with the girl and makes her abort the child. Armanda is the figure of the slave who is mistreated by whites and treated only as an object.
Father Against Mother. Machado de Assis. Slavery took with it occupations and apparatuses, as did other social institutions. I do not cite some devices except because they are linked to a certain occupation. One of them was the fetter on the neck, the other the fetter on the foot. There was also the tin plate mask. The mask made the slaves lose their addiction to drunkenness by closing their mouths. It had only 3 holes, 2 to see, 1 to breathe, and it was padlocked behind the head. With the addiction to drink, they lost the temptation to steal, because it was usually from the Lord's pennies that they took to quench their thirst, and there were 2 sins extinct, and the right sobriety and honesty. Such a mask was grotesque, but social and human order is not always achieved without the grotesque, and sometimes the cruel. The tinsmiths had them hanging for sale outside their shops. But let's not take care of masks. The neck fetter was applied to runaway slaves. Imagine a thick collar, with the thick rod also on the right or left, up to the top of the head and locked at the back with a key. It weighed, of course, but it was less punishment than a sign. A slave who ran away like that, wherever he went, showed a repeat offender, and was soon caught. Half a century ago, slaves often ran away. There were many, and not all of them like slavery, It happened occasionally that they were beaten, and not everyone liked to be beaten. Most were just reprimanded. There was someone from the house who served as a protector, and the same owner was not bad. Moreover, the feeling of ownership moderated the action, because money also makes you suffer. The flight was repeated. There were cases, although rare, in which the smuggling slave, only bought in Belongo, fled and ran, without knowing the streets of the city. Of those who went home, not infrequently, only the shrewd ones asked the Lord to rent them. Whoever lost a slave to a scrape gave some money to whoever took him. He would place advertisements in public publications, with the fugitive's signs, name, clothing, physical defect, if any, the neighborhood he was in, and the amount of gratuity. When the amount did not come, there was a promise: you will reward yourself generously, or you will receive a good reward. Often the advertisement had an illustration on top or to the side, the figure of the fugitive, barefoot, running, a stick on his shoulder, and at the end a bundle. He protested with all the rigor of the law against anyone who gave him shelter. Now, catching fugitive slaves was a time occupation. It would not be worthy, but because it is an instrument of the force with which the law and property are maintained, it brought this other implicit distinction of claiming actions. No one dabbled in such an occupation for pleasure or expertise. Poverty, the need for a pecuniary increase, the unfitness for other jobs, by chance, and a certain taste of serving too, albeit in another way, gave impetus to the man who felt too severe to push order to the disorder. Cândido Neves, in the family, Candinho, is the person to whom the story of an escape is linked. Resigned to poverty, when he acquired the occupation of catching runaway slaves. This man had a serious flaw: he couldn't stand a job or occupation. He needed stability. That's what he called bad luck. He started out wanting to learn typography, but he saw early on that it took some time to compose well, and even then he might not get what he wanted, was what he told himself. Commerce caught his eye. It was an appropriate career. With some effort he worked his way into a haberdashery as a clerk. The obligation, however, to attend and serve everyone struck him in the court of pride, and after 5 or 6 weeks he was on the street of his own volition. Clerk of the registry office, usher of an office attached to the Ministry of Empire, postman and other jobs were left shortly after they were obtained. When Miss Clara's passion came, he had nothing but debts, albeit few, because he lived with a cousin, a carver by occupation. After several attempts to get a job, he decided to adopt his cousin's occupation, from which, by the way, he had already learned some lessons. It didn't cost him to contract others, but, wanting to learn quickly, he learned badly. He didn't make fine or complicated works, just cloths for sofas and ordinary reliefs for chairs. He wanted to have something to work on when he got married, and the marriage didn't take long. He was 30 years old. Clara 22. She was an orphan, lived with an aunt, Monica, and sewed with her. She didn't sew so much that she didn't date a little, but boyfriends just wanted to kill time, had no other commitment. They spent the afternoons, they looked at her a lot, she at them, until the night made her retire for sewing. What she noticed was that none of them missed her or made her want. Maybe she didn't even know the full names of many. She wanted to get married, that's all. He was, as his aunt told him, a reed fisherman, to see if the fish took the bait, but many did not risk taking the bait. Some would just circle around the bait, look at it, smell it, and then move away, going after others. Love brings envelopes. When you saw Cândido Neves, she felt that this was the possible husband, the appropriate and unique husband. The meeting took place at a ball, such was to recall the boyfriend's first occupation, Such was the opening page of that book, which had to come out badly composed and worse embroidered. The wedding took place 11 months later, and it was the most beautiful celebration of the couple's relations. Clara's friends, less out of friendship than out of envy, tried to push her away from the step she was going to take. They did not deny the bridegroom's kindness, nor his love for him, nor even some of his virtues. They said that he was given too much to profligacy. "Well then," replied the bride, "at least I don't marry the dead." "No, not dead, but is that?" They didn't say what it was. Aunt Monica, after the wedding, in the poorhouse where they took shelter, spoke to them once about possible children. They wanted one, only one, though it would compound the need. "If you have a child, you will die of hunger," said the aunt to her niece. "The mother of Jesus will give us to eat," said Clara. Aunt Monica must have given him the warning, or threat, when he went to ask for her niece's hand, but she, too, was a friend of feasts, and the wedding would be a feast, as it was. Joy was common to all three. The couple laughed about everything. The same names were exchanged: Clara, Nevis, Cândido. They didn't make you eat, but they made you laugh, and the laughter was digested without effort. She sewed more now. He went off to do one thing and another. She didn't have a job right. That's not why they gave up their son. It was the son who, not knowing that specific desire, let himself be hidden in eternity. One day, however, he gave the child a sign of himself, male or female. It was the blessed fruit that would bring the couple's longing desire. Aunt Monica was disoriented. Cândido and Clara laughed at her surprise. "God will help us, auntie," insisted the mother-to-be. The news spread from neighbor to neighbor. There was nothing more to wait for the dawn of days. The wife now worked more consistently, and that was necessary, since, in addition to paying for the sewing, she had to make the child's trousseau with scraps. By dint of thinking about the child, he was already living with her, changing her diapers, sewing her clothes. The requests for new sewing were insufficient, the waits lengthened. Aunt Monica helped, it is true, even if unwillingly. "You will give your son a sad life," she sighed. "But aren't other children born too?" asked Clara. "They are born, and they always find something right to eat, even if little." "Sure, how?" "Right, a job, an occupation. But what does the father of that unfortunate creature who comes to spend his time on?" Cândido Neves, as soon as he learned of that warning, went to see his aunt, not harsh, but much less meek than usual, and asked her if he had ever stopped his wife from eating. "You haven't fasted until a Holy Week, and that's even when she doesn't want to dine with me. We never fail to have our cod." "I know, but there are 3 of us. We'll be 4. Is not the same thing." "What then do you want me to do, besides what I do?" "Something more correct. Look at the carpenter on the corner, the haberdasher, the typographer who got married Saturday. They're all guaranteed a job. Don't be angry, I'm not saying you're a vagrant, but the occupation you've chosen is uncertain. You go weeks without money." "Yes, but there comes a night that makes up for everything, even more. God doesn't abandon me, and the runaway black nosy doesn't play with me. Almost none resist, many surrender soon." She was proud of it, spoke of hope as safe money. Soon he was laughing, and making his aunt laugh, who by nature was cheerful, and anticipated a feast at the christening. Cândido Neves, who had abandoned the carving profession, as he had given up many others, better or worse, felt fulfilled in capturing fugitive slaves. He didn't make him sit for long hours doing a boring task. All it required was strength, a keen eye, patience, courage, and a piece of rope. Cândido Neves read the advertisements, copied them, put them in his pocket and went in search of the runaway slaves. He had an excellent memory. Once the signs and characters of a runaway slave were filed away, it took little time to find him, hold him, tie him up, and take him away. His strength was great, his agility too. More than once, on a corner, talking to someone, he would see a slave pass by like the others, and he would immediately discover who was a fugitive, his name, his lordship, his house, and his reward. He would interrupt the conversation and go after the fugitive. He didn't catch it right away, he analyzed the opportune place, and in one leap he had the reward in his hands. He didn't always leave without blood, the nails and teeth of the other. Usually he beat them without the slightest scratch. One day, profits began to run low. The runaway slaves no longer came, as before, to get into Cândido Neves' hands. There were new and skillful hands. As the business grew, more than one unemployed person took himself in a rope, went to the newspapers, copied ads and went hunting. In the neighborhood itself there was more than one competitor. That is to say that Cândido Neves' debts began to rise, without those payments ready or almost ready in the early days. Life became difficult and hard. It was eaten on credit and badly, ate late. The landlord was in charge of the rents. Clara didn't even have time to mend her husband's clothes, so much was the need to sew them out. Aunt Monica helped her niece, naturally. When he arrived in the afternoon, she could see from his face that he didn't bring a penny. He ate dinner and went out again, looking for a fugitive. It already happened to him, although rare, to deceive himself, and to take a faithful slave who was going to the service of his master. Such was the blindness of necessity. She once captured a free black. She made excuses, but received a large sum of punches from the man's relatives. "That's what you needed," exclaimed Aunt Monica, when she saw him enter, and after hearing the misunderstanding and its consequences narrated. "Leave it alone, Cândido. Look for another life, another job." Cândido had actually wanted to do something else, not for the reason of the council, but for the simple pleasure of changing occupations. It would be a way of changing skin or person. The worst thing was that he didn't find anything at hand that he could learn quickly. Nature went along, the embryo grew, until it weighed heavily on the mother, before being born. The 8th month has arrived, a month of anguish and needs, even less so than the 9th, whose narration I also dispense with. It is better to say only its effects. They couldn't be more bitter. "No," and Monica shouted Cândido, refusing advice that I find it hard to write, let alone my father listening to it. This never. It was in the last week of the last month that Aunt Monica gave the couple the advice to take the child that was born to Roda dos Ejeitados. In truth, there could be no harsher word to put up with two young parents who were stalking the child, to kiss him, hold him, watch him laugh, grow, get fat, jump, discard what, reject how. Cândido widened his eyes at his aunt, and ended up punching the dinner table. The table, which was old and disjointed, was on the point of falling apart entirely. Clara intervened. "Auntie doesn't speak ill, Cândido." "Why, bad," replied Aunt Monica. "For better or for worse, whatever it is, I say it's the best you can do. You owe everything, the meat and beans are missing. If there is no money, how does the family grow? And then there is time, later, when you have a more secure life, the children who come will be received with the same care as this one or more. This one will be well created, without missing anything. So, is the wheel of the foundlings some kind of beach or pile of rubbish? No one is killed there, no one dies for nothing. Well, here it is right to die if you live in starvation. Anyway." Aunt Monica finished her sentence with a shrug, turned around and went into the bedroom. She had already hinted at that solution, but it was the first time she had done so with such frankness and unkindness, cruelty, if the reader prefers. Clara held out her hand to her husband, looking for encouragement. Cândido Neves grimaced and called his aunt crazy, obviously in a whispering voice. Their tenderness was interrupted by someone knocking on the front door. "Who is it?" asked the husband. "It is me." It was the owner of the house, a creditor of 3 months' rent, who came in person to threaten the tenant, who allowed the landlord to enter. "It's not necessary. Do a favor." The creditor came in and refused to sit down. He glanced at the furniture to see if it would do anything for the pledge. He thought it was worth little. He came to collect the rents due. He couldn't wait any longer. If within 5 days he wasn't paid, he would have to evict them. He had not worked to please others. On seeing him, no one would say he owned it, but the words supplied what the gesture lacked, and poor Cândido Neves preferred to remain silent rather than retort. He made an inclination of promise and supplication at the same time. The owner of the house did not give in any more. 5 days or street, he repeated, putting his hand on the latch of the door and leaving. Cândido left next. In these bids he never got to despair. He calculated to take out a loan. He didn't know how or where, but he was ambitious. Too much. He turned to ads. He found several, some already old, but in vain. He had been looking for them for a long time. He consumed a few hours to no avail, and returned home. After 4 days, he found no solutions, went to friends of the owner, reaching no more than the order to leave the property. The situation was exasperated. They couldn't find a house to rent, nor did they find anyone to lend them one. Was to go to the street. They didn't count on their aunt. Aunt Monica went to a well-to-do old lady's cubicle at the back of the coach house, on the sides of a courtyard. She even had the greater procedure of not saying anything to the two of them, so that Cândido Neves, in the despair of the crisis, would start by rejecting her son and end up finding some safe and regular means of obtaining money, to amend life. In short, he listened to Clara's complaints, without repeating them, it is true, but without consoling them. On the day they were forced to leave the house, he would astonish them with the news of the gift, and they would sleep better than they thought they would. So it happened. Put out of the house, they went to the favor room, and 2 days later the child was born. The father's joy was enormous, and so was his sadness. Aunt Monica insisted on giving the child to the fondling wheel. "If you don't want to take it, leave it to me. I'll go to Rua das Barbadas." Cândido Neves asked him not to wait, that he would take her himself. Note, reader, that it was a boy, and that both parents desired just this sex. They gave him some milk, but as it rained at night, he woke up his father to take him to the fondling wheel the next night. In that he reviewed all his runaway slave notes. Gratuities were largely promises, some carried the written and meager sum. One, however, went up in value. It was a mulatto woman. There were indications of gesture and dress. Cândido Neves had been researching it without better fortune, and had given up the business. He imagined that some slave lover had picked her up. Now, however, the new view of the amount and the need for it encouraged Cândido Neves to make a great last effort. He went out in the morning to observe and inquire around Rua e Largo da Carica, Rua do Pardo and Rua da Ajuda, where she seemed to be walking, according to the advertisement. He didn't find her. Only one pharmacist on Rua da Ajuda remembered selling a gram of any drug 3 days earlier to the person who had the signs indicated. Cândido Neves seemed to speak like the slave's owner, and he politely thanked her for the remark. He was no happier with other fugitives of uncertain reward or of little value. He returned to the sad little house they had lent him. Aunt Monica had arranged the diet for her new mother herself, and she already had the boy to be taken to the fondling wheel. The father, despite the agreement made, could barely hide the pain of contemplation. He didn't want to eat what Aunt Monica had kept for him. I wasn't hungry, he said, and it was true. He considered 1,000 ways to keep his son, none did. He couldn't forget the very hostel he lived in. He consulted a woman, who was resigned. Aunt Monica had painted the child's upbringing for him. The misery would be greater, and it could happen that the son would find death without recourse. Cândido Neves was forced to keep his promise. He asked the woman to give her son the rest of the milk he would drink from his mother. So it was done. The little one fell asleep. The father picked him up and went off in the direction of Rua das Barbanas. That she thought more than once of returning home with him, it is true. No less certain is that she wrapped him up a lot, that she kissed him, that she covered her face to preserve him from the serenity. On entering Rua da Guarda Velha, Cândido Neves began to slow down. "I'll give it to you as late as I can," he muttered. But since the street was not infinite or even long, he would finish it. It was then that it occurred to him to enter through one of the alleys that connected that one to Rua da Ajuda. He reached the end of the alley and, turning to the right, towards Largo da Ajuda, he saw a woman's figure on the opposite side. She was the runaway mulatto. I do not give here the enthusiasm of Cândido Neves for not being able to do it with real intensity. An adjective suffices, let's say huge. When the woman went down, he went down too. A few steps away was the pharmacy where he had obtained the information I mentioned above. He went in, found the pharmacist, asked him to be kind enough to put the child away for a moment. He would come for her without fail. But Cândido Neves didn't give him time to say anything. He left quickly, crossed the street, to the point where he could catch the woman without creating a ruckus. At the end of the street, as she was going down São José, Cândido Neves approached her. She was the same one. She was the runaway mulatto. "Arminda," she shouted, as the runaway announcement called her. Arminda turned without malice. It was only when he, having taken the piece of rope from his pocket, took it from the slave's arms, that she understood and wanted to run away. It was already impossible. Cândido Neves, with robust hands, tied his wrists and told him to walk without a fuss. The slave wanted to scream. It seems that she even let out a louder voice than usual, but she understood right away that no one would come to free her. On the contrary. He then asked him to release her for God's sake. "I am pregnant, my lord," she exclaimed. "If your lordship has a son, I beg you for his sake to let me go. I will be your slave. I will serve you as long as you want. Release me, my young lord." "Follow," repeated Cândido Neves. "Let me go. I don't want delays. Follow me." There was a struggle here, because the slave, groaning, was dragging herself and her child in her womb. Anyone who passed by or was at the door of a store understood what it was and naturally did not come. Arminda kept claiming that you were very bad, and would probably punish her with whips, which, in the state she was in, would be worse to feel. Surely he would have you whipped. "You are to blame." "Who tells you to have children and then run away?" asked Cândido Neves. He wasn't in a fit of laughter, because of his son who had been there at the drugstore, waiting for him. It is also true that he was not used to saying great things. He dragged the slave along Rua das Aribes, towards Rua da Alfândega, where the master lived. At the corner, the fight between them ignited. The slave put her feet against the wall, backed away with great effort, to no avail. What she achieved was, despite being the house next door, to spend more time getting there than she should have. She arrived, at last, dragged, desperate, panting. She still there, she knelt, but in vain. The gentleman was at home. He did the call and the rumor. "Here is the runaway slave," said Cândido Neves. "It's her. My lord. Come on, come in." Arminda fell into the hallway. Right there, the slave's master opened his wallet and took out the 100 mil race as a bonus. Cândido Neves pocketed the money, while the master again told the slave to come in. On the floor, where she lay, in fear and pain, and after some time of struggle the slave miscarried. The newborn entered this world lifeless, between the mother's groans and the owner's gestures of despair. Cândido Neves saw the whole spectacle. He didn't know what time it was. Whatever they were, he needed to run to Rua da Ajuda, and that's what he did without wanting to know the results of the accident. When he got there, he saw the pharmacist alone, without the son he had given him. He wanted to choke him. Fortunately, the pharmacist explained everything in time. The boy was inside with his family, and they both went inside. The father received his son with the same fury with which he had taken the runaway slave a little while ago, a different fury, naturally, a fury of love. He thanked her quickly and without gratitude, and rushed off, not to the fondling wheel, but to the lone house with his son and the 100 mil race bonus. And Monica, after hearing the explanation, forgave the little one's return, since she had brought the 100 mil race. She said, "It is true, some harsh words against the slave, on account of the abortion, in addition to the escape." Cândido Neves, kissing his son, between real tears, blessed the escape and did not speak of the abortion. Not all children survive his heartbeat.
If you like our channel, subscribe, like, activate the bell to receive our news.